I'm excited to see so many of you on the line. My name is Jessica Gorham, and I'm the Regional Emergency GBV Advisor, working on behalf of the Gender-Based Violence Area of Responsibility, or GBV AOR, which is the global coordination mechanism for gender-based violence in emergencies. And at country level, we often are termed subclusters or subsectors. And I'm happy to be joined today by my colleague Akiko. And Akiko, if you want to just say a quick hello.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the session. And thank you, Jessica, for leading this very important session. So this is the part 2 of GBV risk mitigation session, focusing on what sector, how we can, mitigate GBV risks and what interventions. So thank you for joining, and we will look forward to having a very fruitful session. So, we will, this will be a very participatory session, and we hope that at the end of the session, we can come up with some recommendations to follow, so that, we can work together, how we can jointly address, GBV risk mitigation. Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Akiko. And I also want to give a big shout out to our colleague who's based in Geneva. Shiva, thanks for joining us today and providing us with technical support. Particularly because sometimes our Wi-Fi goes in and out. So we're really thankful that Shiva, you have decided to sit in on this training today for the whole time and do some of the technical aspects. So very much appreciated. Speaking of some ground rules, if we could make sure that we are muted throughout, unless I ask or pick a volunteer to read some of the information, or if you are providing feedback on a query, so you can quickly mute or unmute. You can also raise your hand, and you'll see a place to do that at the bottom of your participant list. Or if you go to more, you'll see different options there as well. You can send reactions as well if you're happy with something. If you're extremely happy, you can send even better reactions. And our second sort of ground rule is if you could please put your cameras off throughout the next 2 hours, because we have people calling in from many different places, and the Wi-Fi or the bandwidth is not always the same. And even here in Nairobi, we sometimes have trouble with our bandwidth. But I will give everybody a wave just so you can see who is here talking to you, as I mentioned. So it's really great to see everyone. And welcome again to our 2-hour session on mitigating GBV risks in WASH interventions. I am going to try and speak very slowly. So some of you might think, wow, she's speaking very slow. But I also recognize that many of you on the call, that English might be a second language. So I will try my best to speak slowly and clearly throughout. So some might say, oh, it's a little bit too slow, but bear with us so that we can capture everybody on the line today and they feel confident listening to me in English. If at any time you have a question and you don't want to unmute, you can always write in the chat. And we have Akiko and Shiva and others monitoring the chat today, and myself. So if you have a question or anything else, please do write it in the chat. And then we can answer them as they come in. We also find that this saves a bit of time throughout the presentation so that we can get to more questions And also, if you feel a bit shy about asking questions just directly, please do write them in the chat, or if you have any problems with the way the process is going. Is everybody clear? Good. All right, I'm going to turn my video off, but I want it. Essam, I like that. Essam Adam, I see some thumbs up already. We're already looking at our emoticons, which I love. So good. I'll turn my video off, as I mentioned, so that you hopefully will give those that need it a little bit of a boost. But I'm here with you. All right. As Iko mentioned, this is really part 2 of a 2-part series we are doing for risk mitigation. Next slide, please, Shiva. So I hope that all of you who are on the line today were able to join us last week for one of our trainings on the Pocket Guide. So when we talk about key responsibilities for WASH actors, we have two main responsibilities. So the one that we discussed, need to be prepared to respond if a survivor comes to you for help. And that means having an updated referral information and to really just understand how to provide safe and appropriate referrals to services when you, as a WASH actor, encounter either a survivor of gender-based violence or someone at risk of violence. So there are lots of limitations. We don't expect you to be a case manager or act as a GBV specialist or to do any kind of follow-up with that survivor or person at risk. But if you had attended our training last week, you'll know there were some key points. And I do recognize some of these names. I see Sally's name on here and Fatima. Can you give us those that had attended last week's session on the Pocket Guide? Can you tell the group some of the main points that came out of those discussions? You can also write them in the chat as well, but please feel free to go off mic, unmute yourselves, or write in the chat. What were some of the main key points that came out of the discussions last week when we were talking about the Pocket Guide and key responsibilities for WASH and across sectors? Who can help me? I see Sally, I see you on the line, and I know you were quite active. Can you help us with some of those main points? Sally Abdallah. What do you think? Any thoughts of some of the main points that we talked about during the Pocket Guide training? I also see Sarah. I know that you attended our sessions last week. Any thoughts? And you can write in the chat as well. Anybody? Okay, let's think. We talked about what are the limitations. As we mentioned, we have two expectations for WASH actors. One is that you'll implement programming in a way that minimizes GBV risks. I'm going to say programming or interventions. And then the second one is be prepared to respond if a survivor comes to you for help during the course of your work. So one of the key things that came out of the discussion last week is We would never seek out survivors, for instance. This is only if a survivor approaches you. We also very much spoke about the need to maintain confidentiality, the need to respect those who are standing in front of you. Safety and security are sort of our guiding principles. And that all equals a survivor-centered approach. And then lastly, there was a bit about PFA, which is the psychological first aid model that we use when potentially you would come in contact with a survivor. And we watched a video. Next slide. Shiva, can we? Yeah. So let's watch the video as a quick reminder of that second responsibility, which is the responsibility to respond. Go ahead, Shiva. Thanks.
Gender-based violence is among the most widespread forms of violence. Women and girls are especially vulnerable to GBV, but it can also affect boys, men, adolescents, elderly people, and those with disabilities. This film is for humanitarian workers who may meet people disclosing GBV incidents during humanitarian crisis. GBV incidents are often hidden, and supporting survivors is always complex and sensitive. If a survivor approaches you and discloses an incident, ensure that any urgent needs receive immediate attention and that you're both safe. Listen carefully and treat any information given as confidential. Do not ask details. Do not record any information about the incident or the survivor. Inform the survivor of the options available to them. Only share accurate and up-to-date information about services available in the area and explain how to access them. If you are asked to help contact any type of service, the survivor must understand and agree to who will be informed and what will happen next. This is informed consent. If they give their consent, follow the referral pathway defined by GBV specialists in your area. Respect the survivor's choice. Do not counsel them or try and force assistance. Do inform them that help can also be sought at a later stage. Regardless of if a survivor chooses to access services or not, do not share details of the incidents or personal identifiers unless the survivor asks you to do so. Remember the key principles of safety, consent, confidentiality, and respect. You can only offer support if the incident is disclosed directly to you by the survivor. Under no circumstances should you look for GBV survivors. This can endanger them and yourself. If someone other than the survivor approaches you, give them information about available assistance that they can share with the survivor. Explain that safety and confidentiality must be preserved. Training and guidance from GBV specialists are essential to understand how you can assist survivors safely. Ask your manager what's available. You and your team should also be familiar with your agency's code of conduct and know that any sexual exploitation or abuse by humanitarians is strictly prohibited. If unsure of what to do at any point, seek advice from a GBV specialist whilst upholding confidentiality.
Great. Thank you, Shiva. So what do we think? Can somebody just quickly give some top points from that video? I'm also not afraid to pick volunteers. Okay, Amna, go
Yes.
ahead.
Hello, everyone. The video was very useful, and some of the key points is that I don't have to search for survivors unless they approach me. And first of all, if I want to take the information, if I want to have more details, but I don't have for the small, I don't have to ask for the smallest details. But if I want to take some details in order to help them, I have to take their consent. I have to assure them that everything between us that has been said is confidential, and that I will not tell anyone about it to ensure their safety. And also I have to respect whatever the story they tell me. I have to respect them, and I have to take their story seriously. What else?
That's pretty
Those are-
good. Yeah, Amna, somebody was paying attention. I appreciate that.
Thank you
And
so
when
much.
you, very good, excellent. And when you mention details, you might get details from a survivor or a person at risk through the course of your conversation. But as we said in the video, we shouldn't be probing, because our main task is to link them to another support system who has the skills to either help them gain more services or who can talk to them in a safe and ethical way. Okay, how about others? Any other points that others want to bring up? You can write in the chat as well. I do want you to take a look. Taban, why don't you? What do you think, Taban? Go ahead, Taban. I see your hand raised. Any thoughts?
Yes,
Go ahead.
yes, this is some. Yeah, I think the main point, the summary of this video is we have to consider the key principles of safety, consent, the confidentiality when we are dealing with the GBV cases and when we are approached by GBV survivors. I think this will summarize the whole content of the videos. Thank you.
Yeah. Yep. And Robert's reminding us about confidentiality. Really good. That's exactly right. And I want us all to remember that Akiko put a link to a list of all of our GBV working group coordinators in your area. So last week, we talked a lot about the need to link to either a support person or another type of service. And if you're in doubt, then you should always contact the focal point, the GBV working group coordinator focal point in your area. And so you can see that here in the chat, which Akiko gracefully provided. And if you're unsure, you can always contact Akiko or someone else or Noha at the GBV subsector, and they can make sure that you do have that contact information. So thank you very much. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we did have, as I said, sessions last week, which you can also find the recordings for online on our YouTube channel. So thank you to that. Okay, and as I mentioned, today we're going to discuss that second responsibility. The second responsibility, or the one that we talked about, next slide, please, Siva, is that you ensure that all of your programs and or interventions purposely mitigate potential GBV risks, so that we don't inadvertently cause more harm just through the act of our interventions. Can you imagine? And we're going to go over what some of those risks are, because you also, through the registration process, you were able to list already what you thought many of those risks were. Just like we have the pocket guide, which we went over last week, which shows us how that we engage with a person at risk or a survivor. For this responsibility, we also have another set of guidelines for integration. So we call these the guidelines integrating gender-based violence interventions in humanitarian action. So it should actually be, right, mitigating gender-based violence intervention or risk mitigation. I'm going to wait to show that. Actually, let's watch the video now. And then that'll give us a little bit of insight into these guidelines, if we're able to, Shiva. Thank you.
Imani is alone, in the middle of a crisis. An earthquake has taken everything: her home, her family, and her way of life. Basic community services to protect her health and security have been disrupted. She is exposed to the danger of gender-based violence, GBV.
But you can help keep her safe, even save her life. By implementing the new IASC gender-based violence guidelines, you can help protect Imani from GBV, promote the resilience of her community to reduce the risks she faces, and ensure that she knows where to get appropriate care when she needs it.
There are millions of people like Imani who are threatened by GBV. It is one of the most common human rights abuses in the world, happening anywhere and at any time.
Whether you realized it or not, you will likely have encountered GBV survivors and perpetrators during your work and in your daily life. Some are people you know.
Worldwide, women and girls face a high risk of GBV. In fact, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual or physical violence in their lifetime. This risk can be even higher in crisis-affected settings. But you, as a humanitarian worker, can help turn the tide.
You might think tackling GBV always requires specialist skills. It doesn't.
You might also think that it's not really your responsibility, but it is. It is the responsibility of all humanitarian personnel. All that's required is commitment and understanding. It's doing the work you already do in ways that are safe for everyone.
This is where the guidelines come in. No matter what sector you work in, you can help prevent GBV and help save and protect the life of a girl like Imani. Survivors and those at risk of GBV are often afraid to speak up. You can help them find their voice.
You don't need to be a GBV specialist to use their guidelines. They offer short, practical, and simple recommendations to help you identify and reduce GBV risk and implement safer programming within your day-to-day work.
The guidelines follow the humanitarian program cycle to offer useful tips on integrating GBV prevention into assessment, resource mobilization, implementation, coordination, and monitoring and evaluation.
The guidelines promote awareness and understanding of GBV, vital to developing safer programs.
The new guidelines draw on 10 years of experience and the latest in best practice to provide an action-based, effective reference for all humanitarians.
The comprehensive guidelines book is also split into 13 sectors, each having its own standalone thematic area guide, or tag. You can use whole guidelines or just the tag that applies to your sector. They provide you with positive, practical recommendations to complement your experience and program priorities.
We're all responsible for reducing the risks of GBV that vulnerable people like Imani face every day. By delivering safe, participatory and sustainable programs, we can reduce risks, promote resilience and aid recovery in communities we serve.
Start implementing the GBV guidelines today. Download the main book or the tag for your sector at www.gbvguidelines.org now.
That's right. We are going to start today, and this training is really just a first step. And I suspect that there are many of you who have already, in fact, learned a bit about how we mitigate GBV risks. Okay, I want us to look at some key terms before we continue on. And these are really at the foundation of what we do when we talk about gender-based violence. We can't talk about gender-based violence without talking about power. And this is particularly relevant when we're talking about the WASH sector. Who can help me read out that top line about power? I'm also okay with picking volunteers. Who can help me read out the top one? A new voice.
Can I?
Go ahead. Yes. Amna, yep. And then we're going to get a new voice. Go ahead, Amna.
Okay, thank you. Key terms: power, the ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-making processes. It can be both real and perceived. Gender is an important determinant of power. Informed consent.
Okay. Go ahead.
Making an informed choice freely and voluntarily by persons in an equal power relationship. Acts of GBV occur when there is no informed consent. Children under age 18 are unable to give informed consent for acts such as female genital cutting, marriage, sexual relations, etc.
Great. Thank you, Amna. So let's
Thank
talk
you.
about power and the WASH sector, water and sanitation and hygiene. That first bullet point says a lot, right? The ability to control and access resources, opportunities, and decision-making processes. Who can help me out here? When we talk about power and the WASH sector, what are some of those vectors of power, or where is the power centralized? Can someone tell me? When you think of the word power and WASH, you can even just brainstorm here a little bit. What do you think? How about Dahlia? Dahlia? What do you think when you hear the word power with regard to WASH? Go ahead, Dahlia.
Sorry, I have a problem with connection, but I just joined the meeting. Can you please repeat it again? Sorry.
I sure can. Yeah, Dahlia, we're talking about power.
Okay.
And how there is a power imbalance when we see GBV or when people encounter GBV. And I want us first to recognize the power that the WASH sector has. What are some of those areas when we talk about power in WASH, particularly when we relate to women and girls? There's some obvious ones.
Okay. By nature in the communities, the girls and women are recognized as empower or less in the community than the domination by there is a gender imbalance in the communities. Power power can be in designing of the project itself. We need to put in our mind that to recognize the girls and women's need in designing in the first place in the designing of each project. The participant of the women should be one of the things that we should put it in mind, not recognize something. So we can sit in the office and designing all projects. I think we need to go and and ask what the specific needs of specific communities.
Good. Excellent. Yep, Dahlia, I think you could probably help me co-facilitate this workshop. Really good. How about Layla? I see Layla on the line. Can you help me? Are there other areas where you think there's power within the WASH sector? I'm going to ask Layla. What do you think, Layla? When we talk about power, I see some hands raised, but I will, I'm going to tell you all right now, I'm also good at picking volunteers. I see Mohammed. All right, how about Mohammed? What do you think? What are some areas where we see power and actually power differentials in WASH? Go ahead, Mohammed Yassin. You have to speak a little bit louder, Mohammed.
So like the provision of water, it's one of the most important things in the designing the project of WASH, as my friend Shiri mentioned, and having ability to control or directing the water access for the people.
I'm going to stop you right there. So Mohammed just said, who's in control of the water? Isn't this the rub, right? This is always the way, right? So Mohammed, you made a really good point. Who controls access to water?
Can actually have
Mohammed, you have to speak up very loudly.
The one who controls the water have a big say in controlling power, and by result, like it can have some effect on the GBV or the violence that will be implemented on the communities that we serve.
Really good. Yep. And the really unfortunate part is that women are expected to collect water for the household, but they are not in control of the resource, which puts them at a huge power difference. So they are forced to be able to get the water, but they're not in control of that resource. Okay, Hiba and then Taban. Go ahead, Hiba. What else? Hiba Abdeslam. Go ahead. You have your hand raised. Or Taban. Taban, did you have any other things to say? Emmanuel? Okay.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Go ahead.
I think about power, what I would want to say is that during need assessment, you find that a lot of times women are not given the responsibility to the opinion in terms of where the water points should be positioned, or how many kilometers from their residence. This is very important. You find that women a lot of times are not included in such decision making. So to me, I think that is key. Women should be involved in that process before this is done. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Really good. Okay. And Issam,
Hello?
did you have some?
Hello?
Yeah, Hiba, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I think encouraging women and engaging women in decision making is the first, I think, priority in designing WASH projects, so that we can make the gender equality and the equity also, and also the justice in distribution goals and responsibilities, starting from the grouping, the working group of this community which affected by the WASH challenges, and with what we will provide them our services, and also not to leave the disability of women behind us. So that encouraging women by conducting some working groups, women groups, and then some activities that let them raise their voices, some awarenesses to know their rights to prevent GBV.
Good.
Over. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Hiba. That's exactly right. And we didn't even mention, right? We mentioned water as a huge one, but we didn't even mention yet the facilities themselves, the access to those, how they look, right? There's a difference between whether they're available and whether they're accessible. We didn't mention menstrual hygiene, which is a huge factor. I see some more hands raised. If you want to add a comment about power, please do so in the chat, because we're going to go on to the next slide, and I'm going to ask Robert and Isam to help me read some of those out. So let's talk about GBV increases in emergencies. We know that gender-based violence exists in Sudan. With or without this emergency, gender-based violence exists. Can anyone tell me what the most prevalent type of violence is? Can you write it in the chat for me? Nazik, smarty, yeah. Yeah, the most prevalent type of violence globally, even regardless of where you're from, is still intimate partner violence. That doesn't mean that we minimize sexual violence. But in terms of the prevalence, intimate partner violence, which is violence that is perpetrated by someone known, an intimate partner, to the survivor, even in places like Sudan, IPV is the most prevalent. Whether it's Somalia, South Sudan, Kenya, where I live, IPV. And we see that play out in the WASH sector. We see both sexual violence and domestic violence directly linked to the roles and responsibilities of women and girls in the WASH sector. If women do not provide water to their households, they could be exposed to gender-based violence, even when that water isn't available. It's still their responsibility. Yeah, Layla, you mentioned emotional violence, really good, right? And sometimes we almost say sometimes that's even more the impact because you can't see it, right? And it's hard to treat emotional violence. Does that make sense to everybody when we talk about sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and the linkages to the WASH sector? Robert, how about you help us read out some of those factors here? Go ahead, Robert. You have to speak very loudly. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello?
Yep, speak loud, Robert.
Reading from the first.
Yep, go ahead.
GBV increases in emergency. some of the key factors. There is a lack of privacy and overcrowding. Then we have changes in the family structures where more women may become more household heads, and they are taking more risks to access to food and NFI, unsafe routes to wash services, distribution and the facilities, a lack of privacy at wash and the other facilities, separation from family members, increased care and stroke housework for women and the girls, breakdown of protective social mechanisms. We have increased the vulnerability and dependence on assistance, the sexual exploitation and the abuse. That's a share in brackets. Negative coping mechanisms like survival sex. Then lastly, we have non-exhaustive list. These risk factors are context specific.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Thanks, Robert. That was perfect. So all of these, though, right, this is sort of a general list, but I feel pretty confident that they are all relevant to the Sudan context. When we talk about all of these as risk factors for gender-based violence, particularly toward women and girls, but also sometimes towards boy children, not as much, but sometimes. Lack of privacy and overcrowding. Changes in the family structure. Even in Sudan, we have more female-headed households, and it's a trend across the region. Once we have IDPs or internally displaced persons, we have an increase in female-headed households. Even in an emergency, the roles do not change for women and girls. They just become harder to fulfill. We need water to survive, and it is the role and the responsibility of women and girls to provide that water at household level. Full stop. Whether you create projects and programs that give us water, it doesn't matter. Women are still responsible for it. And that's why it's so important that we have this conversation. And that you recognize the responsibility that you have to ensure the safety and security of women and girls who really are your main stakeholders. It's them. 100%. They are responsible for household level water collection and use. And I want us to think critically if we're the ones, if women and girls are the ones that we're engaging with most often. And I can guess the answer, which is no. And even now on wash committees and others, right? We say, well, we'll try to have 25%. Why not 100%? Why not 70%? They're the ones who are responsible for getting water. And yet we're negotiating in terms of statistics and percentages about how much they can be included in these interventions. We need to change this narrative. Full stop. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk. We asked you during the registration to identify some of the GBV risks that you have encountered in your work. And there were 4 main categories that were pretty universal to everyone who registered for this training. Which also, in one way, it's a positive and it's an opportunity that you all recognize these risks. On my other hand, It makes me sad that we're not mitigating these risks. Let's look at this photo. And I tried to pick photos that would really speak to the risks that you identified. This photo, the caption, where I found it, right, in an IDP camp in Sudan, it is identified actually on the border of South Sudan. This is identified as a semi-permanent, potentially permanent wash facilities. What are some of the risks that you see in this picture? Or maybe you don't. You can write them in the chat. And I want to hear some new voices if I could. What do you think? What are some of the risks you see here? Can anybody help? Any new voices? Yep, Manon is saying no locking system. It's not even possible to lock these. These are made of tarpaulins. We've all seen it, right? The doors. Yeah, let's talk about those doors. Nazik, do you want to tell us a little bit about those doors and what the issue would be? What do you think? Yeah, Nazik, go ahead.
Okay, Jessica. Hello, everyone. So for what I understand from these photos, the doors it could be like a big problem because it's not good locked doors. If we are going to treat these latrines as the permanent latrines, they should be in a good structure way. Good doors with zinc sheet, for example, or either if it could be from local materials, but they should be with the proper locker. And the second latrine, as I see, there is no roof there. So this could cause a GBV risk. Maybe someone can look for the people who are inside the latrines.
Yeah, great. Sarah, I see that you've wrote quite a few here in the chat. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing that I hope you're concerned about? Sarah?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm just like looking at it and the locking system, there's a lot of slits in the tarps, which kind of leave the overall facility very vulnerable to anyone just walking in whenever they please. So it's not a very secure layout for the actual use of the tarp. There's a lot of entrances that people can come through.
Really good. And also at the top, you can see there's a gap. I'm sure a lot of that is for ventilation, but it also is a huge issue in terms of safety. Really good. And we saw that it's not separated. Alfadil, you're saying it's not separated. I can't even tell who this is for because it's not marked. This is latrines that are currently in Sudan. And you are all WASH colleagues who implement programs such as this. And I wonder if we were on a field mission, would we feel comfortable using these latrines? It's a safety issue, but come on. We would not accept this in our own residences. Guaranteed. If you're building a house, you would not accept this as a latrine. Even if this is somehow, and I don't know how this would be, because we know that NGOs and the UN, they get money to do this. Why they would choose these materials even. And then we know, because this picture was captioned as a semi-permanent structure. So this isn't in a transit site. We can do better. And I like here at the side, oh, we're going to put a very nice hand washing station on the outside. That's right, Maha. No one can be comfortable in such a latrine. And let's be real, right? The dynamics of when women use the toilet compared to men is different. In terms of how we move our clothing around, the squatting, there's a lot of it. This is a dignity issue and it's a safety issue. Yep, Ines, it's not safe for girls at night. And we have studies that have been done when it is unsafe to use latrines or bathing areas, latrines, there's been an increase in Somalia in urinary tract infections. So there's a safety consequence, but there's also a health consequence. And somehow this exists. I didn't make up this picture. And I want us to all think about, right, all of the interventions we've been doing. Do you think that women and girls were part of the process here? And Robert, I see what you're saying. Partners are yielding to donors' demands to do much with less. But come on. We could do better with just these materials. It doesn't make sense. This was built by someone that doesn't care. There's no way you can even close those tarpaulins. We can do better. And you're right. And the confusing part, I think, for us is that when we talk to donors, they say, we agree. We agree. That there isn't the friction that we hear about. What I suspect is it's easy to construct latrines that look like this. And you can check it off of your intervention list. But when you have to be more thoughtful, it takes more time, but it's safer. And who's going to use them more, right? All right, next picture. So what else was mentioned by all of you as a major risk? What do we see here? What does this picture tell us? What do you think? What are some of the risks associated? This is something universally. Yep, Kiden, Stella, go ahead. Stella, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think when you compare the size, the container of the water that the small girl is carrying, and also the same container the big woman is carrying is improper when it counts for weight control. So this girl is already been abused. She's carrying what is absolutely very heavier and can damage her life. That's my observation.
Okay. And what you mentioned, Stella, is important, but it's not necessarily a GBV risk, right? It's more of a physical risk that they might have. But good one. What do we think? What do we know? Because you all mentioned this as a GBV risk, so a protection risk. Yep, Nazik, you're saying, yeah, I mean, if we look at the surroundings, we can make some assumptions here. And we don't even have to, because I'm going to show you the results of an assessment we did in Sudan. And women and girls have said, universally, the water points are too far. Yep, so Manan, you're saying long traveling distance, so more exposure to sexual violence, particularly. Yep, really good. Yep. What do we see also when we look at lack of resources or accessibility? That child should be in school. And why aren't they in school? because of this, right? So we also know during emergencies that girl children, particularly adolescent girls specifically, stop going to school because they need to fulfill these duties, particularly that they have to go and get water, right? Yep, limited amount, really good. Limited amount of water make the women go many times to the water resources, which increases the opportunity for sexual violence. So Zamzam, the resources are far. And this is another one I struggle with. We know in Sudan, women are being raped and sexually assaulted on their way to get water. Full stop. Who's responsible? Who's responsible for mitigating risks during water collection? Tell me. It's right. I mean, but is it about defense, Dr. Hanan? Is it about defending them, or is it making sure they have access to water that's closer to their shelters and where they live, their settlements? Yeah, Isam, it's the wash sector. I'm going to say it out loud. It is the wash sector. I can guarantee you, because we've had donors say it in the past, when I put into my project proposal a whole section on lights and locks, we will not get funded. Can you imagine if in my GBV proposal, I put in for a water pump? Do you think I'm going to get funded for that? I can tell you, no, we will not. And nor would any of our WASH colleagues want us to put that in. They say, no, that's not your job. We're not competing with you, these non-specialists, to do this. With water. And they have to make a choice every day, potentially faced with sexual assault or providing water for their families. And I want us to think about whether if we had to make that choice, or if we would send our daughters out, Akiko, right, to 6 hours. Would we? No. So you all mentioned this as a risk as well. Okay, next slide. So the next one that you mentioned is hygiene or bathing facilities. And in this picture, where is the bathing facility? Can anybody identify it for me? So this is an IDP site. What do you think? Where is the bathing facility here? Can anybody point it out to me? You can write it in the chat or unmute yourself. There's lots of different issues with this one, but I picked it because I think this, yeah. Nazik, you're right. Yep, you're exactly right. Yeah. Robert, it's the small blue container on the right. Yep. Voila. Yep, the blue one on the right. That's the wash facility. So just to say, there's a wash agency who received money from a donor to put up these facilities. And they're writing donor reports that say they've put There's a wash, there's latrine block, and then there's also wash facilities. What are some of the risks, do you think, with that wash? How about Wala Imam? I see that you wrote in the comments. What do you think are maybe some of the risk factors for this? Wala Imam.
It is not safe.
Mm-hmm. What makes you nervous when you see this?
The ceiling and the material of the building.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yep. What else? Any others? Dr. Hanan, right? You're concerned about the door because we see that there's panyas or material that's separating. I also think no lights. Yep. Maha, you're saying the gate. The gate is really, it looks like some of these IDPs tried to make a more sort of mazed entrance, right? Because you see there's material here, but not part of the original design. Yep. Yeah, Sarah, I am also concerned about the location. It's surrounded, it's right near the other latrines. And if based on previous experience, I'm not 100% sure those latrines are disaggregated by sex. That makes me super nervous. No privacy is a huge one. And what about cultural norms in Sudan around bathing? Can anybody help us? What's the cultural norm, particularly for women, around bathing? And to a certain extent around using latrines. Can someone tell me? Yeah, go ahead. I see a hand raised. Who do we have? Yeah, Nazik, go ahead.
Okay, so for bathing facilities in Sudan, culturally, it should be a separate latrines for women and men for bathing facilities and even for latrines. So it should be a separate, and then it's very important, the privacy issue. So the
Very,
men should
right?
be in other area and for women should be in the other area.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, particularly in Sudan. For instance, I lived in Mali at the start of my career for 2 years, and I lived in an area where all the latrines came up to my shoulder in this certain, with this certain ethnic group. And they said, oh, that's fine for us. I was like, oh, I'm feeling very vulnerable in my own bathing area. So what would work potentially with that ethnic group in Mali would definitely not work in Sudan. And we're seeing threads of that in this picture. Yep, Islam, it should be separated by men. Yeah. And this is the thing, we often have a certain number of latrine blocks to build. And we're going to come, I'd love to know why we don't separate them. So many times it's not even about the number of latrines, it's about separating latrines. We're going to come back to that. I'd love to know what your thoughts are on why we don't do that regularly. Why aren't we, Isam, I see you're unmuted. Isam, why aren't we separating it? Because I'm not going to say it's about money because you have a certain amount of money to build latrines. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, usually in urban areas, I think usually they are separated, and sometimes even women are shy to go to use a mixed latrine mixed with men and women. But in IDPs come and settlements because of the funding and something, and in some in institutional areas because of lack of funds, maybe they don't do separate latrines for men and women. But in most urban areas, they are separate latrines for men and women in the home.
Thanks,
Therefore,
Issam.
yeah.
What about others? Because I'm hearing about funding, but if you have funding to build a latrine block for women and a latrine block for men, which I'm assuming you would do, right, in your project proposals, what are some of the reasons that you're not separating those out? And you can write in the chat. Okay, so I'm not hearing any, right? And remember, is the goal of your project to simply build these facilities, or is it to have people use them? Yeah, it always comes back to that when we talk about risk mitigation. Okay, next slide, please. I think this is the good. So this one, it was harder even for me to find a picture around menstrual hygiene. So this is the fourth risk factor that you all identified during the registration. The first one was the latrines. You said no locks, no lights. They weren't made of materials that were safe. Distance. The second risk factor that you all identified as wash actors was distance of water collection available as well. And some of you even mentioned cost of water. The third one you mentioned was bathing facilities, that they weren't segregated, they weren't clean. And then the last one you mentioned, and this was almost universally, and maybe Akiko, if I'm wrong here, we will get into some other ones as well, but I think those were the four main ones. And Shiva, you were also going over these. The last one was mental. I'm mental over this, that's for sure, was menstrual hygiene management. And I just chose this picture just for visibility, because it was harder for me to find even pictures that show what that looks like. There were lots of really happy kids receiving sanitary pads in schools, but I couldn't find one that looked at how we are doing this in emergencies. So I'd love to hear from all of you. What are the particular risks that you are seeing related to menstrual hygiene? Who can help me here? Because almost all of you put this down as well as a risk, an area of risk. Anyone? So Sally, one of the consequences of lack of hygiene or menstrual hygiene products is a loss of dignity, for sure. But why did you identify menstrual hygiene as a risk factor for GBV? Anybody? Help me out here. How about some people I haven't heard from? How about Abdul Rahim? Barima, what do you think? Abdul Rahim Barima, what do you think some of the risk factors are? I see some people have raised your hands. Okay, good. Sally, we haven't heard from you today, but it's nice to see your name on the line. Go ahead, Sally. What are some of the risks you are seeing?
Hello, Jessica. Thank you. I see that there is a risk of separation from the family because when the periods come, she needs some privacy, or a girl could become shy of showing, and because there is no hygiene baths, she just shy away and move away from her family and beloved ones. So she loses the risk of separation and support in this matter. Thank you.
So Sally, you're saying that when adolescent girls particularly are menstruating, that in Sudanese culture, they're separated, particularly if they don't have access to hygiene materials, which could be, right?
Exactly.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good, right? And then who knows, right? It then creates a lot of vulnerability. Good. Yep, Taban, you're mentioning the lack of water for menstrual, very much. And I think Dr. Hanan, you mentioned some of the consequences, which we could have, well, you said vaginal diseases, but similar to that, right? We could have, and others, loss of dignity, right? A lack of hygiene for sure. What else do we know? Can anybody tell us?
Yeah, hi Jessica. Hello
Go
everyone.
on.
Yeah,
Go
Hanan.
ahead.
Actually, the like to be away from the school because they are not going to school anymore if they are not finding even the facilities or the resources like pads, everything,
Good.
even the water. Yeah.
Yeah, really good. And we also know that oftentimes adolescent girls will resort to what we call survival sex sometimes, or trading sex for money so that they can buy what we consider a basic need. This is biological. It's not as though women and, girls can turn this off. This is biological. And so they often turn, and I don't like this term necessarily, I'm going to use it because we use it so often, negative coping strategies, right? That they engage in relationships sometimes for money, which is rape, it's force, it's gender-based violence, full stop. And Isam, you brought up another good reflection, is also when we talk about disposing menstrual items. This goes the lack of segregated latrines, because oftentimes this is where, if it's a pit latrine, and also the need for us to identify and distribute environmentally safe hygiene materials. Yeah, good. So we know a lack of hygiene materials could impact schooling, which, as we know, is a lack of a resource, which is gender-based violence. It could impact whether someone's exposed to sexual exploitation and abuse, which is gender-based violence. It could directly impact the physical safety if they are required to move out during their menstrual cycle, which is physical violence. So many intersections. Yep, and Akiko, such a good point as well. And oftentimes there's not enough clean water to wash reusable sanitary pads. Or they don't have soap to do that. It's a safety issue, but also a dignity issue. Okay, let's see our next slide, please. Okay, which brings us, all of these things you've mentioned. The really sad point is they're not new. Everything that you've mentioned that's happening today in Sudan is not new to this sector. These guidelines were developed over 10 years ago, and every one of those risk factors you mentioned were identified here as well. So as you can see on the left, we have the big guidelines. And then we wanted to make it as easy as possible for all of you. So we also have these thematic guides. And we have one that's specific to water, sanitation, and hygiene. And I think that Akiko put the link to this guy. Ah, she's so good. Thank you, Akiko. Yeah, and you'll find this guideline. It's not very big. Something you could easily carry in your bag, your handbag, or your laptop bag, which I know all of you will do after this training. And it really identifies essential actions to help mitigate those risks that we've just identified. Is everybody clear about this resource? We recognized so much the importance of GBV, we created guidelines specifically for every sector and thematic sector out there to help you mitigate risks. That's how important this is. And you can see every sector is represented, as is water, sanitation, and hygiene. And it was developed in cooperation or in partnership with WASH specialists. So it's not just the GBV folks who are saying, I think this is a good idea. It's also all of you. And I want us to note this IASC logo here in the corner. This means that these guidelines were endorsed and approved by the Interagency Standing Committee, which means at the very highest level, this is the executive director level of all of the UN agencies and also NGOs. At the very highest level, they have agreed that these need to be incorporated in every response. So it's not just me saying this, Jessica, who I think this is an amazing idea because I see those risks every day for women and girls. But the very most senior level of the humanitarian community, whether it's the executive director or the head of WFP, UNICEF, UNFPA, FAO, you name it, they've all signed off and agreed that we have to adapt these guidelines, along with all of our NGO partners as well. So even if, and I hate to say this, but even if you're not on board with the dignity and the safety, just by the nature of you working for one of these agencies, it means that you are responsible, full stop. But I hope through our conversations, you're really seeing also the importance of it for the safety and security and also the dignity of women and girls. Okay, next slide, please, Shiva. So really this guidelines, as we mentioned in that beginning video, it takes us through the humanitarian program cycle. So it has a poster-sized checklist of essential actions for all WASH participants. It takes you through the assessment, analysis, and strategic planning phase. It talks about resource mobilization, Robert. You mentioned that, and Isam mentioned it as a potential barrier to implementing some of these. We included it. And I can't reinforce enough, every time that we have spoken to a donor, they have been more than willing and amenable to incorporate these interventions throughout sector responses. And if you have a donor who says, no, nope, I don't want to buy locks, then you need to take it to a higher level. You can come to your GBV counterparts because there's some sort of disconnect. What we hear from donors is this not included in the project proposals. That of course, that donors funded these guidelines, big ones, the Americans. They funded the development of these guidelines. FCDO, the Brits, they helped us develop these guidelines. So this is what the sort of disconnect is. I'm not sure. And what they tell us is it's not included. That we don't see projects that include protection measures for women and girls, for the users of the facilities. We have implementation, coordination, and monitoring and evaluation. So today we're going to talk just a little bit about the assessment phase, a little bit about implementation, and then monitoring and evaluation in our last 30 minutes. Okay, next slide, please. So the GBV subsector in April of this year did do assessments. And we do them regularly, actually. And in Sudan, they're constant. But we pulled out some of the results from those assessments that dealt specifically with wash usage, right? So these are kind of the intersect. And I think you'll see that these are really similar to the general ones that we read before. Who can help me read these assessment results? Can I get a new voice? Someone I haven't heard yet. How about Asia Haroon? Asia? Can you read these for me? Asia. Or Isa? Isa or Asia, can I get you to read this slide for me? Go ahead. Go ahead, Zamzam. I see you're off. You can go, Zamzam. I saw Zamzam unmute himself. Can someone? Yep, Dahlia. Why don't you go, Dahlia? Thank you.
Assessment result of April 2023. After the conflict started, women and girls need to travel longer distance to collect water. Lack of female hygiene item and information on menstrual hygiene management. Inadequate waste management, use sanitary napkin, scattering around, which can increase the GBV risk. Lack of standardized gender segregated sanitation infrastructure. Lack of latrine quantity. Latrine in IDPs camps are always overcrowded. Lack of adequate lighting of latrine. Men tend to use female latrines because male latrines are not clean.
Which I mean, the overlapping protection concerns with all of this. And it brings me back to, again, my point. Are your interventions merely successful if you build it? Or is it successful if they're able to be used? And I guess this speaks a little bit to how we monitor and evaluate the success of our projects, right? For instance, when we talk about GBV services, there's indicators around availability, but more so around accessibility. And I wonder if in the same token, within the wash sector, is it just about the availability of the facility, or is it about the accessibility and the userability of the facility? Also to note, in our guidelines, we do have indicators as well that can help you develop smart indicators. So these aren't even now. So what we have is universally trends, risk factors for WASH, right? That was maybe our second slide. We've now reinforced that with what WASH colleagues themselves have identified as risk factors. GBV risk factors for girls. And now we're going to complete this triangle with actually what women and girls are saying from communities in Sudan. I think we can now establish that this is a truth. Okay, next slide, please. So that's a little bit about assessments and how we understand and how you can understand. How do we assess, do you think? Dr. Hanan, what are some of the ways that you as WASH actors would assess potential risks for women and girls in WASH interventions? Can you help me, Hanan?
Yeah, Jessica, and maybe regarding these issues of assessment, before that, we need to direct people or motivate the community even itself to this gender-based violence. I think first of all, to get us the knowledge, and even to get them the knowledge, and even at the same time to give us feedback as communication facilities to have more like to be enlightened of the situation, what's going on, because really it is shame like from them to speak about this issue or to send even a report on that. I think this is if a tool can be one of the model according to the assessment and even the advocacy, and at the same time, yeah, to have it on the ground and to motivate the community. Thank you, Jessica.
Good, good. So has anybody done any assessments around user ability in terms of WASH facilities? And have they asked specific questions around risk? Does anybody have any examples of that? Mark? I wish that everyone had their hand raised. Yeah.
Sorry. According to this situation of the world, because I have been in Port Sudan for a little while, and I made such assessment for those settlement compounds, area for those refugees or IDPs, I mean. It is more than worth, really. No privacy, and even no means of good facilities, even the water. So something like that may lead us to make this such assessment, even on the borders. I made it, and I'm going to raise a report about that. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, agreed. So we know it's happening. So let's see. So the WASH cluster, that's all of you, in partnership with UNICEF, have developed a WASH safety and accessibility audit toolkit. And so we're going to go a little bit into this and then come back again to our guidelines as well. Next slide, please. And you can find this entire toolkit on the WASH Cluster Global website. Why do WASH actors have to mitigate GBV risks? And I think we kind of went through this, so it might be a little bit of a redundancy, but always good to reinforce. Who can help me read that top box? Someone?
I can read. Yes.
Go ahead, Martin. Go ahead.
Yeah. All humanitarian organizations and their staff, consultants, volunteers, etc., are responsible to mitigate GBV risk in their work. Such actions are in keeping with the centrality of protection and principle of do no harm.
Good. Yeah, again, it speaks to the safety and dignity of all users, but also the IASC, the Interagency Standing Committee, has endorsed and promoted this. So at the very highest level, they've said. How about Abdul Karim? Can you read those 2 points? Abdul Karim El Tayeb. The second 2 points. I saw you unmute yourself before. Abdul Karim. Can anybody read the second 2 points? I saw someone unmuted. Go ahead, Margie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
To ensure access to life-saving wash services for all vulnerable population groups, to ensure your programs do not create any additional GBV risk.
Yep, really good. Thank you. And as I mentioned, it's not just about having this service available, it's about being able to access the service. That should be the goal of all interventions. Next slide, please. So GBV mitigation and WASH, what can we do to reduce risks? First and foremost, we consult women and girls of different age groups, including women and girls with disabilities, on their needs, concerns, and priorities for WASH support. And I don't think we're doing that. Or we would never allow the current facilities to be built in the way that they are. There is no woman or girl who would agree to that as a good model for a facility. They're not able to use it. Culturally, safety-wise. And so this is why we have the Safety and Accessibility Audit Toolkit, which is basically to conduct focus group discussions. And there's also an observation checklist that is included in this toolkit to better understand any safety concerns with current or planned WASH programs and to monitor any visible GBV risks and access issues on the route to and around WASH facilities. So this is why I highlighted, we think of this toolkit as both an assessment, so that first step in the cycle, but then it's also circular. This toolkit is also a way to monitor and evaluate current programs and their usability. We need to make sure there's a feedback mechanism in place, be up to date about GBV referral pathways. So talk to the GBV subcluster coordinator, who we know is Akiko, and she has provided the list of focal points for every area in which you're working. She provided it in the chat, and she can do it again as well over email. And then, of course, recruit and involve women in assessment teams and as WASH frontliners as much as possible. So there's a toolkit you can find online at the WASH cluster, and maybe Shiva, can we go back 2 slides so that we can find the link? And then, so it's washcluster.net. Thanks, Shiva. And we can put that in the, I think Akiko can put it in the chat. You can find it online. And so Akiko, if you could put the exact link to this safety and accessibility audit toolkit, we would appreciate that. Okay, next slides. Shiva, please. Yep, and next one. So let's look at women's participation. This is an example that we have from our colleagues in Lebanon about the importance of women's participation, but then also the impact it can have on how you do your work on the ground.
لما أعمل جلسة نشاط الكل بحسوا إنه رغبان ومتشوق المعلومات اللي بنعطيها.
الشغلات اللي تعلمتهم بالدورات
بدي أعلمهم لغيري.
نستفيد منها بشنو؟ بدنا نسويها نستفيد منها ماديا.
لما تقبلوني على إني مرة وأغلب نشاطاتي مع مين؟ مع الأطفال والنساء، بكل سهولة وبكل سلاسة إنه صرت أتعامل معهم. لبين ما أجت منظمة الميرسي كور واليونيسيف وبلشت تساعدنا وعملوا لنا حمامات صحية وقلنا قفول ليحافظوا على النسوان وعلى البنات. 24 ساعة ببرم بالمخيم. بتفقد الحمامات، بتفقد الجوار الصحية، لأنه 3/4 الجوار الصحية عندي بالمخيم براميل وأرض زراعية. بقف مثل الألف بستنى صهريج المي ليجي لأفحص الكلور لأعطي المي للعالم. لما جيت لهون على لبنان كان في كتير صعوبات إلي، بس لما اشتغلت كمحركة اجتماعية فرق كتير عندي الموضوع وشجعت أكتر.
يونس وشركاء بياخذوا كل هيدي الامور بعين الاعتبار، وكل الاشخاص اللي هن معرضين للخطر، وما بنكون عم نخترع نحن اشياء جديد، نحن عم نامن هالحمايه باقل كلفه ممكنه وبطريقه فعاله.
Great, thanks, Shiva. So another example of the importance of women's participation. And we saw a couple of things coming out of that. Awareness raising, specifically targeting women and child, is much more likely to be accepted when it is presented by another female. And also you could see those two women understood the vectors of risk, right? They were quite sure about where those risk factors were. And so they were constantly evaluating and monitoring. So let's go back to this assessment and toolkit. First, it's also about understanding the risks for women and girls, but then also persons with disabilities as well, because it's about access, we said, right? It's about access and then the issue of do no harm. And basically what the toolkit does, there's a series, and I'm going to take you through that in the next couple of slides, a series of tools that you can use to assess risk and accessibility of these services. And I'll show you in the next slide how that looks. Who can help me with this slide? Can I hear a new voice? Someone we haven't heard yet. Can you read this slide for us? Key risks faced by persons with disabilities. Can I hear someone new? You can just, thanks, Jane. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jane. Okay, I think we've lost maybe the sound. Amal? Go ahead. Samar. Amal, yeah, Amal. Go ahead, Amal.
Yeah, hello.
Yep, go ahead.
Key risk faced by persons with a disability more than twice as likely as their peers without disability to experience violence, with a higher likelihood of all forms of violence. Girls with a disability up to 3 times more at risk of rape than girls without disability, and twice as likely to experience other form GBV. 24% of childhood with the children with more than one functional difficulty or are out of primary school. 47% more likely to be underweight, under 34% more likely to be stunned compared to child without disability. 22% less likely compared to children without disability to have improved sanitation facility in their household, and 26% less likely to have improved drinking water source in their household.
Thank you. So we know that households that have persons with disabilities living in them are less likely to have improved sanitation facilities and less likely to have improved drinking water sources for their households. And this is, we also know that persons with disabilities are more than twice as likely to experience sexual violence. And they say potentially around 33% in terms of other forms of violence, which is also why we talk about persons with disabilities, because they are at one of the highest risks of exposure to and victims to gender-based violence. And so this toolkit, because it looks at risks and accessibility, it's very much relevant as well to persons with disabilities. Okay, next slide, please. And so just very quickly, the Safety and Accessibility Audit Toolkit will help you identify GBV risks and access barriers for persons with disabilities in WASH facilities, but also for those at risk of gender-based violence, right? And it looks at, there's two main tools. One is guides for focus group discussions, and the others are checklists through water, common core areas, water points, latrines, and bathing facilities. So all those areas that you looked at as risk factors. And it uses the REACH. You can see this approach, and it has from the user perspective and then also the facility perspective. So I really encourage you to go online and specifically look at the tools within this toolkit. Again, there are some site observation checklists, and then there's also guides for focus group discussions. And we expect you to use these at the assessment phase of the project cycle, but then also at the monitoring and evaluation phase. Is that clear to everybody? Any questions? Okay. Next slide, please, because I see we have about 10 minutes left, and I want to get to our, I want to get to back to this program cycle. I want us to get some concrete ways that we can address the risks that you've identified today. And this is about implementation, although it feeds in, right? It's a circular process. Okay, next slide, please. And this is actually our last slide. What can you do tomorrow to mitigate these risks in your work? That's what I want as a takeaway for today. I want us to think about what we can do tomorrow to mitigate the risks that you all have identified. You, from the provider perspective, have identified them. And we've verified those risks with women and girls who are in our communities. What do you think? What can you do tomorrow in your work to mitigate these risks?
Hello.
Yep, Jane, go ahead.
Yes. As what we have gone through, from Human Appeal UK in Sudan. So I think it's well clear to all that we have gone through. What I have seen, that we have to see the access of the water the women from the IDPs or from the refugees are going to, whether it is safe or not, provide that the service is really well separated according to the GBV. GBV rates. Okay. Two, we make sure physically we have to see the latrine. How are they sharing? Are they sharing together or what?
Okay.
And even the construction, even according to what we have gone through, that means we have to make a concrete that is so safe for the women and girls and being separate from the rest. Okay.
Yep.
Good. Four, to the other side, that we have seen the facilities, the hygiene. We have to provide them so that they may not use the clothes or the mental or something of that kind, because it's really a problem. It's really a problem, okay? Because when it is so hot, it's also going other sides scientifically, it can cause problem for them. 4, I can say that the other picture shows that there is a too crowded and it is not well separated, and everything is just, you know, not being separated, and also things are closed, like it's like the whole place is a bush place, you know.
Mm-hmm. But and these
I
are
think
good
the rest,
points.
yeah.
Oh God. Jane, these are good points, but what do we do to mitigate these risks tomorrow? Because we know that women and girls are being raped today.
Yeah, yeah.
So what
For
are we
us,
going to
we
do
have to
tomorrow?
save. We have to make sure the water is inside for them to have very close inside their gathering points or inside their refuge place. Okay. 2, we have to make sure that the latrine is separate from where the men are, and also their own have been separate, you know.
Yeah.
And
Okay, good.
4, we have to provide the facility, the hygiene guide for them, so that they may be safe in hygiene, in a part of hygiene.
Okay.
In a place where we save the facilities, we have to make sure it's not too crowded, it's very far, and you can see everything is really in a safe place.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks, Jane. So
you're welcome.
First of all, I want us to, all of you are either based in Sudan or you're directly communicating with your colleagues in Sudan.
We are in Sudan, but we are working.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry, Jane. Yeah, no,
Sorry.
sorry.
Okay.
I didn't mean to throw that out at you again. But yeah, now I want us to think critically about what we can do tomorrow. One, and I think, Jane, you mentioned this a little bit, and Stella, I'm going to come to you next. We need to do safety audits. If you don't know what the risks are in the areas in which you work, you need to do a safety audit. And we have provided those tools in the toolkit. Is that clear to everybody? But
yes.
I suspect for most of us, we already know what the risks are, unless somehow you're working in an area that's completely different than the rest. Stella, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you so much. I think
you
this
give us
question is
something we can do tomorrow?
Yes, I think this question is very, very important for this training, and most especially for us who works in the front affected areas. For us to mitigate this risk, I think we first discuss the cause of how this risk came about. I think the assessment tools that are used to get information, some of these protection aspects were not being incorporated in. So to mitigate this, we should ensure that in every tool that we use for assessment, or in every information that we want to get from the community, affected community, more especially in Sudan, we need to ensure that the cross-cutting questions on protection that are taken into consideration, more especially in the world sector, when we are going to the community and we're creating awareness for ICU materials, we need to incorporate protection information inside it so that people are able to get the clear information from the beginning. And also the manuals that we are using for any construction of any wash facilities, any awareness in part of the software, those manuals has to be improved in the way that people are able to identify and understand how we are working with in an emergency with things that are not really more of standard sometimes, but because of lack of funding on other things. So the basic way of mitigating this risk is to create proper awareness and also improve on the qualities of the material we use for construction and following some standards that are being provided in the SPEAR standard, incorporating with the experience, and also I think borrowing experiences from other countries. That's my view.
Good. Thanks, Stella. Really good feedback from both you and Jane. So one, practical. Practical that we're going to do is you're going to, tomorrow, you will go online and you will download the toolkit. Is everybody in agreement? If you don't take this on, women are going to be raped and they're going to be abused. They're telling us this. Women and girls are telling us because of these interventions, they are not safe. It's not me that's saying this. I'm merely a vehicle in which to relay this information. Awesome. Fatima, Martin, I like it. And then we use those tools. We use the observation checklist, and we encourage our colleagues who are interfacing, women particularly, to talk to women to understand how to mitigate these risks. Things that we've done. We've had WASH colleagues organize group trips to water sites. We could do that. That's easy. We have printed out signs that have said men and women so that it's very clear which facilities belong to whom. And then we've set up volunteer community networks to monitor, to make sure that men are using the male facilities and women are using the female facilities, just like they did in Lebanon. And that doesn't cost anything. Longer term, we need to do what Stella and Jane have suggested, which is we need to build differently and we need to change the narrative. Short term, we can make sure that community volunteers, which is part of all of our programming, are trained to monitor that there is disaggregation. We can make sure, even on these latrines, which are so subpar and it's shameful, we can make sure there are signs that clearly designate male and female. The signs aren't enough. We need to make sure that there are mechanisms, community protection mechanisms in place to ensure that we have a pattern of use, right? That males know they have to use these, females know they have to use those. For when we look at these two young people who are carrying water, and I know that there are young people and women in Sudan who are being raped and sexually assaulted, we can make sure through our WASH and water, our WASH committees, that we have groups that go out on water collection and volunteers who lead those groups. We can do that. When we talk about menstrual hygiene, we need to collaborate with the GBV sector to make sure that those are included in project proposals for SURF and others, because they're being lost. And more importantly, because we're introducing new types of menstrual hygiene products, they need to have training around it. Questions about simple, low-cost interventions that you can do tomorrow. Thanks, Amal. Yeah, frequency of M&E. Sure. Yep. Because I guarantee if this was your daughters or your sisters or your mom that was forced to do and to access these services, you wouldn't like it and you wouldn't agree with it. And we should afford the same dignity, the same ethical and safety considerations for everyone. That is my last plea for you that have joined us today. I know we are on time, so I want to hand it over very quickly to Akiko. If you have any last thoughts before we end the session today.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for a very informative, comprehensive session that really captured all the issues we are facing in Sudan. Really, really appreciate it. And, thank you everyone for the very active participation. I really wanted this forum to come up with some concrete way forward how we can jointly address. So I will share, all the materials that are mentioned, in this session by email. We all have, we have your email, all of you, as well as some of the recommendations, all the recommendations that Jessica summarized by, towards the end of the session. And this is not the end. This is really the beginning of, us working together for GBV risk mitigation. So, we will certainly continue this conversation. We are also planning Arabic sessions in the future, which will be conducted by my colleague, Nuha, who's a national coordinator. But thank you again for everyone. And thank you to Jessica and also Shiva, for, organizing this session.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Make sure as well, we have everyone here who has registered. We'll make sure to send out the links, and we will make sure that we add some of these really sort of easy, simple interventions that can have a lot of impact. Ahmed, the monitoring and evaluation part is also in the toolkit. That's what we monitor, right? The accessibility and the usability. Thank you, everyone.